One of the best things about making YouTube videos, for me, is the thrill of the hunt. How one silly little thing can take you down a big old rabbit hole and lead you to a story that you need to shout about. It's lovely. Now I've got one of those today, and it all starts with a rather silly looking mascot who, back in the 80s and 90s, was seen a fair bit on television sets as part of a game where people could use their phones to win big prizes. But it might not be the one you're thinking of. Yes, we are going to be talking about Hugo. This little troll is definitely a big part of the story, but this journey actually starts with his predecessor, OsWALD. You don't get Hugo without OsWALD, and the initial hit leads to some behind-the-scenes struggles and movements when it comes to creating his successor. But this struggle, and the phenomenal success that would eventually come with Hugo, basically helped to build a gaming industry in Denmark that would be massively important to the world of gaming as a whole. You can connect it all, right down to the people themselves, back to OsWALD and Hugo. Now, is it a big revelation to present these connections? For all of the many cultural landmarks that have come from Denmark, whether it's tragic Shakespeare princes, the films of Lars von Trier, highly lauded temples of gastronomy, or Peter Schmeichel singing about Danepack bacon, it is a relatively small nation of a little under 6 million people, so perhaps it's not surprising that these direct connections exist. But it is a rather fun story that can be woven from these oafish looking characters that you probably remember quite well from those touch-tone TV phone games, if you're of my age, and we're actually a hell of a lot more successful than you may think. So let's begin. Before we get to Hugo, we must first meet OsWALD. So where do we start with this one? We start with a guy named Ivan Salverson who was, by his own admission, a frustrated programmer on the C64 who'd tried to make a game based on some of his favourite activities, but had been disappointed with the results. However, he became pretty good at other aspects of coding. Specifically, he was good at fixing games, and also cracking them. In other words, he was part of the demo scene. From there, he found himself becoming the editor of a C64 and Amiga magazine called Compute in 1985, where he'd spend the next couple or so years. At least until he got a call that changed everything. A producer at Nordisk Film named John Berger contacted him and asked if he knew anyone who could create a game for TV2, the country's new public service channel that was set to start broadcasting in October of 1988. Ideally, Berger said, it would be a game that people could control over the phone. Now perhaps naturally, Ivan thought that instead of being a middleman, perhaps he should try and present something himself. And so, he pulled together a little team consisting of fellow Amiga scenesters, programmer Espen Krogh Hansen, designer Jesper V. Jorgensen, and Mikael Baller on sound. This quartet would be named Silverrock, and it was Jesper Jorgensen who had the idea for a bear named OsWALD jumping about on blocks of ice and collecting presents. This little game would be called OsWALD of the Ice Floes. The game itself is, as you might expect, pretty simple. After all, it was to be played via touch-tone telephones using dual-tone multi-frequency signalling, or DTMF. Basically, it's the same sort of tone signalling that happens when you call up a service and have to choose from a list of options on the phone. You press the corresponding button, and it's picked up by a modem on the other end. OsWALD jumps either up, left or right to the next ice block or whale that's in the water. These directions would be represented by 2, 4 and 6 on your phone's keypad. Don't even think about calling in if you've got one of those sad old Git rotary phones, grandad. There are no diagonal inputs, so the success of your jump is determined by how close you are to the ice block in the next lane. This simple solution is the best practice here, really. Playing this game via a touch-tone phone is naturally going to result in a considerable amount of lag, so you don't exactly want the inputs to be super tight. OsWALD's main goal is to collect the presents that can be found along the way, while also avoiding birds that will fight with him, or men that will turn him into an ice block. Also, while he can stay on a regular ice block for as long as he needs to, if OsWALD jumps onto a whale then he'll need to get off of it relatively quick, otherwise it spouts water and sends him up into the sky. There are actually a fair few ways to lose your lives in this simple little game. Whenever you do fail, OsWALD will say a couple of lines, mainly one that roughly translates to, "Well, that was a shame, let's try again."
Det var vel nok ærgerligt. Vi prøver igen.
Ivan said in a presentation that he gave about the game for the Danish Data History Foundation that the inspiration for this phrase came from his wife leaving him because of his long working hours. Strange where inspiration can come from, isn't it? Anyway, it's a very short game. There's only one fixed level, and once you learn it, you can play through the game in literally 5 minutes. I mean, I suppose it would be pretty stupid for this to be an hours-long epic journey. Now, the normal perception of touch-tone games like OsWALD, or indeed its successor Hugo, at least here in the UK, is that they were played by children on Saturday morning shows like What's Up Doc or whatever, because that was certainly the case over here. However, OsWALD actually made his debut on a Friday night entertainment programme called Elevatoren, basically Elevator but with the number 2 in it, that ran from 8 PM onwards. In between various features, interviews, performances and the like, viewers could call in and play the game to potentially win a variety of prizes, with the big one usually being something along the lines of a cruise or other such holiday. The segment proved to be a hit, although at first it doesn't seem as though OsWALD was made available for people to buy, at least not in Denmark. Weirdly, there was a release of the game in the USA through publishers Centaur, with the speech samples localised and not much else added.
Oops, let's try it again and again.
The game doesn't exactly make much sense when stripped out of its interactive TV show context, and it's about 5 minutes long if that, so why the hell Centaur picked this one up and tried to sell it at $40 bloody is frankly beyond me. I can't imagine an awful lot of people bought it. However, soon enough OsWALD would have a sequel of sorts that people in Denmark could actually buy. In 1989, Silverrock would kick the boring, regular old OsWALD to the curb and replace him with Super OsWALD. Okay, Super OsWALD is pretty much the same game. You're still jumping around on those blocks of ice and trying to pick up presents. However, there are a couple of additions that make this slightly more complete both as a game and as a TV segment. The first is that the game now has 2 competitive players trying to pick up those presents, with OsWALD getting a female companion. She's simply named OsWALD Lina and has basically the same lines as OsWALD but with a different feminine voice. The second is that you can pick up a big S and become Super OsWALD.
Nu bliver vi til
Super OsWALD!
In this game mode, our heroic bear flies around and tries to pick up as many 100-crown notes as they can while avoiding the bombs. This game was actually available for people to buy, although I don't believe it was actually on computer shop shelves. Rather, you could send off for it from the pages of the aforementioned Compute magazine. There was also a PC-DOS version of the game, as well as a back-ported version for the Commodore 64. So yes, many people could enjoy the virtues of this title. I mean, if nothing else, it's a fine way to get some practice in the game before calling up the big show and trying to win those prizes. That's the best way to market something this simple, anyway. By this time, OsWALD was starting to get a bit of recognition, what with being part of a TV show that could usually count on an audience of 1 million or so people. But it would be thoroughly eclipsed by its successor. We're now in 1990, and around this time Nordisk Film decided that they wanted something new to replace OsWALD. For Ivan Solverson and his team, however, there was a bit of a problem. That being competition. Jesper V. Jorgensen, the guy who'd originally come up with OsWALD, decided to break away from the team and prepare his own concept to present to Nordisk, meaning that Silverrock had to come up with something totally different. This time, it was Jesper Nysted, Ivan's brother-in-law, who came up with the idea of creating a troll. The actual design of the troll itself was done by Niels Krogh Mortensen, and he would have a voice done by a colleague of Ivan's named Michael Brockdorf. It didn't really take all that long for this big idea to come together, and Ivan's team soon had more than enough to seal the deal once again with Nordisk Film, a flat fee for the TV rights, as well as a split in profits for any merchandise that was sold. For the longest time, this character was actually known as Max. That was always the character's name. However, Nordisk's producer, John Berger, always had a different idea. This troll's name was actually Hugo. He basically insisted on that, and when the character was announced as Hugo, Silverrock weren't exactly told directly. Despite being a bit annoyed by this, they still had to quickly rush through a whole new logo for the character. Skjermtrolden Hugo, or Screen Troll Hugo, made his big debut on the 7th September 1990 edition of Elevaturen in a segment hosted by Nina Glinka Jorgensen, then girlfriend of Denmark's Crown Prince. And well, I suppose you could say that the rest is history. It didn't take long at all for Hugo to become a star in Denmark. Pretty much as soon as he made his debut, he was the biggest attraction on the whole 2-hour Elevaturen programme, a show that he would eventually go on to easily outlive. The first Hugo game consisted of him making his way through a big old labyrinth, collecting bags of gold and avoiding dynamite under a strict time limit in the hope of finding a big old cache of hidden treasure at the end. And with Hugo being such an immediate success, it wasn't long at all before this game was playable in the home. The original Skjermtrolden Hugo was released in Denmark in time for the 1990 holidays, and there was even a single to go along with it, the Hugo Rap. This was the first Hugo-related song to come out, and no, it certainly wouldn't be the last. This first Hugo game even got an international release, although that was a considerably smaller affair. Outside of Denmark, it was actually made available via a public domain label named Bus Stop, although it did get a couple of write-ups, as we'll soon see. This first Hugo game would also, again, have a Commodore 64 version. It's the last time any of these games would appear on the venerable 8-bit platform, and it is a little something to see the big old sprite of Hugo at least make it on there in some form. Back in Denmark, the original Skjermtrolden Hugo was the biggest computer game going in the Christmas of 1990. By this point it was pretty clear that Silverrock had a very hefty hit on their hands, and now the goal was to keep this little troll going and eventually see if he could do anything outside of his native Denmark. Initially, this would mean the creation of plenty more minigames that could be played on television, as well as the introduction of a few new characters. Now, in case you need a bit of a refresher on Hugo, here's a summary of what the game entails. Hugo the Troll takes on various minigames, usually with the aim of rescuing his wife Hugolina and his family from the clutches of Scylla, the evil witch who watches over the action via crystal ball and occasionally makes things that little bit harder for our hero. And of course, because Hugo's a troll, he's going to try and collect lots of bags of gold on the way, or perhaps even find some hidden treasures. Anyway, the games, much like the original OsWALD, usually just make use of up, left and right. Over the years, a whole bunch of minigames were created, with some of the more famous ones being running up the side of a mountain and dodging boulders, taking a handcar down a rail track and dodging trains, flying your biplane and avoiding bombs. A lot of them are all about moving and dodging, mostly simple stuff, although some of the games are a bit more involved, occasionally having a jump button that you can use, or actually allowing for a bit more freer movement. The biplane, one of the better classic games, is a good example, as you fly around using a map for guidance looking both for gold and the entrance to Scylla's Skull Cave. A map is indeed important in a fair few of the games, such as Mine Track or Cliffhanger. There are multiple paths that you can take, and you need to consult the map in order to make sure that you don't go down a dead end. Again, minigames like this often tend to be the better ones, although there's others that work well, such as Snowboard, Skateboard and Balloon, whether it's because of increased speed, better movement, or just because they look quite nice. If Hugo's successful in these minigames, he'll go to a final scene against Scylla herself. On TV, the most common of these was called ropes, and the player would have to pick one of the 3 ropes to pull. One frees the family and captures Scylla, another frees the family but Scylla gets away, and a third one ties up Hugo himself. This choice is, of course, purely down to luck. It's really a bonus screen more than anything. Other end scenes such as Lightning Bolt may actually require a bit more skill, seeing as you get to move around and dodge Scylla's lightning spells on a big chessboard. It wasn't long before plenty more computer games starring the Troll came out. There's a whole lot of releases just for the classic Hugo games alone, and not just on the Amiga. There's plenty of remakes and modernisations, starting from the PS1 onwards. Indeed, the series is still very much going today, largely through online slot games. As far as the Amiga goes, the biggest Hugo release is a German one that consists of 4 minigames, a combination of the 2 main releases on the computer, plus the Ropes endgame. You get the minecart, mountaineering, forest and biplane. However, Hugo's main platform of choice would eventually end up being PC-DOS. All of the 6 classic Hugo games were released there, mostly on CD-ROM, and those versions are most definitely the ideal way to play through these titles, should you want to. It should be noted that these releases usually contain 2 options for playing, a TV version and an arcade version. If you pick TV version, you'll only play through one of the different levels for each minigame, while if you pick arcade version, you play through all of them. When stripped out of the context of the TV show that it came from, what we have here basically amounts to a Laserdisc type game. After all, the movement of Hugo is, in the majority of the minigames, similar to QuickTime events of the sort that you would find in a game like Dragon's Lair. Much like Dragon's Lair, a big part of the game's pull is in the various failure scenes. There's quite a lot of those available for when you do inevitably screw up and send Hugo off a cliff or whatever, and they will be at least amusing for a little while. And of course, as with most any Laserdisc title, the gameplay itself is a bit thin on the ground, and you may well not enjoy the game all that much if you just fire it up in UAE or DOSBox or whatever. There is no doubt that Hugo's quite nice indeed on the graphic and animation front, but there is not exactly a whole lot of motivation to keep coming back to the game once you've beaten it. Except for, of course, the game show side of things. Hugo is tough enough that if you were to phone in to the show and try to play any of its minigames without ever having touched it, you would most likely lose, and lose quickly. So with this in mind, there is certainly an impetus to buy these games as a way to practice them so that, if you did get on the show, you'd actually be able to set a decent score and win something. Obviously this isn't the case when playing the games now, but it's an important context to put the games in.
Ich fühl mich wie Indiana Jones. Bist du schon müde oder was?
What did magazines have to say about Hugo? Well, that varied wildly. There's not a lot of features out there, in English anyway, for the Amiga versions, although the one magazine did want a pretty in-depth look at the game in March of '94. Funnily enough, the original Skemtrold and Hugo did get a pretty excellent score from Stuart Campbell in Amiga Power back in April of 1992, which is probably not something you'd have expected. However, they did review the game as a public domain title, which may go some way to explaining the 5 out of 5 marks that it got. Really though, the biggest kick-ins for Hugo were mostly reserved for its appearances on PlayStation, especially in the UK mags and particularly the first 2 Hugo releases. These basically consist of graphically updated versions of classic Hugo minigames, with the second one having more of a wintry theme. For the most part they really aren't changed for the better at all gameplay-wise or graphics-wise, and certainly not voice-wise, good lord.
Tralderit, tralderat, tralderoot, this game is kaput.
And by and large magazines such as the UK's official PlayStation magazine were absolutely savage on them, slapping a score of 2 out of 10 on the first Hugo game, for example, and most of the other scores for these PS1 versions weren't an awful lot better. It is perhaps not surprising, really. These versions of the Hugo games came out in 1998 and 1999 respectively. I mean, do you really think that these titles featuring a happy little Danish troll were going to get anything but a complete and utter shellacking from a mag like PSM, where it's stuck in between features on Joe Guest's top 10 hottest tips for playing Resident Evil, and the joys of playing Gran Turismo with your mates after a night out talking about tits and drinking Carlsberg? Anywho, Hugo underwent a good few changes after this, but I'll save that for the finish. A lot of people do know Hugo already and know that it was a pretty big hit, but even so, well, its success was damn impressive, probably even bigger than you think. While the game itself, as playable on the Amiga, PC or C64, isn't exactly the best loved thing out there, this was a juggernaut throughout Europe, and indeed even beyond. With Silverrock now its own company and soon rebranded as ITE, or Interactive Television Entertainment, they would sell Hugo's TV rights to over 40 countries around the world, as well as the hardware required for the show, the ITE System 3000, a self-contained unit consisting of the computer and the broadcast hardware. There were some countries in particular where this little troll was just massive, particularly in Germany, where Hugo had an entire TV show all to himself on the Kabel 1 or Cable 1 channel, and the country was, according to Ivan Solverson's presentation, responsible for 50% of Hugo's total turnover. Telemundo picked up the character for broadcast in the United States, and after they renamed him Tino, it would become the #1 show on that channel. Over in Ireland, god damn, he was huge. Renamed Hudai, he was a star for years with several singles and an award for being TV's Personality of the Year. Brazil, Argentina, Spain, France, Turkey, even Russia, China and many more. The long singular tooth of Hugo cast a pretty large shadow over the entire world of television for all of the 90s, and in a good few cases well into the 2000s. The impact of Hugo in the United Kingdom was relatively minor by comparison, it must be said, mainly a couple of slots on kids' TV programming. Now, while the perception that a lot of people have of Hugo may well be a little negative, certainly when it comes to the UK, and particularly if you just played the rather simple games, you can't exactly argue with his success. What with all those TV rights, around 10 million games sold, a pretty hefty load of merchandise also made with the troll on it, and who knows just how many spin-off shows, music CDs, singles, all sorts of strange branches to this tree localised to each country's Hugo, Ivan Solverson estimates that in 12 years, Hugo the Screen Troll had turned over 880 million Danish kroner by 2002, when ITE sold the rights to the character. This is equivalent to a little over £105 million today. It's also estimated by Ivan that around 400 million people had, at some point, watched Hugo, or Tino, or Hudai, or Kuzia, or European Troll in action over the time it spent on the Gogglebox. The phenomenal success of Hugo certainly brought out quite a lot of similar shows, fighting for space with the troll. The UK children's programme What's Up Doc on ITV, for example, which ran from 1992 to 1994, would feature Hugo, but it would also have Joe Razz. This was a more 3D-based interactive TV game show, originally broadcast in Sweden, but owned by the UK-based Total Control Media, ITE's main competitor. Joe Razz himself would end up being quite popular in his own right, although definitely not on Hugo's levels. ITE themselves would work on several other shows and cartoons in a similar vein, such as Crazy Cartoon Soccer, or the rather short-lived Throat and Neck, a significantly edgier take on the formula that was broadcast very briefly in the United States back in 1999. A lot of these later shows also used something called the animation mask system, something that could capture faces in real time and translate expressions to the character on screen. This was actually created by Bjorn Solverson, Ivan's father. There was even an interactive advert created by ITE for Tuborg that allowed viewers to play a quick game and potentially win prizes, even in a little 15-second slot. For a time there were plenty of examples of such interactive shows kicking around, and the technology was also used on some shows that featured regular old arcade or computer games and the like. Certainly a step forward from the earlier days of Motormouth, when the kids used to have to shout instructions down the phone in order to have a crack at Magic Pockets on the Amiga.
Jump, step,
Yes!
walk, step, step.
Good, doing well.
At this point, I would like to thank Dr. J. Wallace for helping out with this section. He has an excellent 3-part article on Hugo, Joe Razz and various other stabs at interactive TV, which will be linked to in the description. For a time in the early mid-90s, interactive television in the shape of Hugo was seen as the next big thing in the industry. The idea of interactive TV wasn't wholly new, seeing as there'd been concepts and tests since the early 80s. The late great Michael Aldrich, Videotex, a pensioner named Jane Snowball doing a Tesco shop through her television back in 1984 and all that. The sort of thing that warrants a discussion all on its own. But Hugo was something of a mascot for a new wave of people thinking about all the stuff you could potentially do through your telly. Sure, the interactive part of the Hugo experience was only limited to whoever was playing the game on the show at the time, but what if everyone watching could play Hugo through their telly and compete with each other? What if you could call up an encyclopedia on your TV to find out more information on something you're watching, or take part in a discussion or poll related to a news item? What if you could order a meal on your TV to go with what you're watching without bothering to pick up your phone? These were the sorts of things people feverishly talked about as things you could possibly do through your TV during this time, including Ivan Solverson himself. However, it did eventually fizzle out in this form, mainly because it wasn't ever quite able to progress beyond the likes of Hugo and other games. Now, none of this is to say that the idea of interactive TV totally failed. That most certainly isn't true. There's lots of aspects of interactive TV that survived and thrived, whether it's having a TV guide that you're able to navigate through, or various digital red button services like what you've got on the BBC. Still, these are the simple concepts. The red button was, after all, replacing something that already existed in the shape of teletext. It's the ideas that you find being promoted in various vids hyping up interactive TV as the future, whether it's shopping through your TV, calling up a movie and ordering a pizza at the exact same time, playing a quiz or answering a poll and the results coming up in real time, challenging your TV to a relaxing game of chess. Those are the sorts of things that didn't exactly catch on, or couldn't be implemented within the existing infrastructure. After all, a lot of them were exactly the sort of thing you'd end up being able to do more efficiently on that there information superhighway. The explosion in popularity of the World Wide Web in the early mid-90s didn't exactly do a lot for the sort of plans for interactive TV that were breathlessly talked about in infomercials or popular mechanics. Now, that's not to say that broadcasts like Hugo or some of the concepts talked about weren't ahead of their time in many ways. There's talk of things that were still pretty far from being formalised, but the technology wasn't really there at that moment for television to be able to execute these concepts on a wide scale. And what of Hugo in the end? Well, as mentioned previously, he's still going in one form or another today, even though the company that created him, ITE, has long since ceased to exist. Ivan Solverson's involvement in ITE ended in 2002, when he sold the company to venture capitalists. The games related to Hugo had by that stage moved on from the usual collections of minigames. Following the two classic releases on PS1, ITE would release 4 more traditional 3D platformers starring the Little Troll for the platform from 2000 to 2003, where he'd get a whip and become more of an Indiana Jones style adventurer. These games are, well, by and large they're very average indeed. Not totally hideous, but not exactly good either. The first one, for example, can best be summed up by saying, "We have Crash Bandicoot at home." I highly recommend that you check out the brilliant Sean Shaunson's video on Hugo's PS1 efforts if you'd like to see them in more detail. Again, I'll link to that in the description, and he also talks a lot about just how big Hugo, or Hudai, was over in Ireland. There's also the Agent Hugo games for the PS2. There's 4 more of these ones, and unsurprisingly they consist of our big-eyed hero doing a parody of James Bond, again in a style that's mostly 3D platforming with a bit of driving around. Again, these fall firmly into the land of mid. You've also got the late 90s, early 2000s games that were based on another Hugo-based TV programme named Jungle Island, all sorts of more educational spin-offs released in various countries, a Game Boy title that's actually a version of one of the Crazy Castle games that usually starred Bugs Bunny, tons of freemium, slots, and other assorted games available on mobiles and the like in more recent times. There's a lot of Hugo out there. But as I'm mainly interested in the classic Hugo minigames and their impact, it's probably best to draw a line here. Hugo the Troll is a pretty Marmite sort of character. You look at his design, those big eyes, that frizzy dark hair, the single tooth that's sticking out and his tendency to knock on your screen and spout cheesy one-liners, and you will most likely either feel glorious adoration or profound disgust. A lot of this may well depend on where you come from and your memories of the character and his show, if you have any. Again, I don't think those memories are as strong over here in the UK as they are in other countries. But he unquestionably had a huge impact. When you look at the Danish games industry, one that's given us the likes of IO Interactive and the absolutely incredible Hitman series, not to mention the origins of Unity Technologies at Over the Edge in the mid-noughties, a platform that's completely changed how games are made. Well, this country's industry has had a pretty outsized impact on gaming as a whole, and in many ways Hugo was the initial spark, the big success that helped it happen, and you can't really ignore that, even to the point where you have people like Jesper V. Jorgensen, who were previously at Silver Rock before moving on to Xerinx and then later onwards to IO, where they'd co-found the company and help create the original Hitman Codename 47. You can connect an awful lot of industry to the success of Hugo, and no matter what you think about him and his corny old minigames, he certainly deserves his flowers. Hopefully you've enjoyed this big old look back at his works, and until the next time, bye for now.